War II interrupted his labors, and he served with great distinction during the war. And in 1955, he began 12 years as governor of the state. These are all things that you all know. This is a man that needs no introduction to this group. As governor, Mr. Faubus touched the lives of Arkansas people as few others have, and everything from building roads to advancing public education, from expanding services for the handicapped to spearheading industrial growth. Governor Faubus has lived a rich life full of accomplishments, and I'm honored and very, very pleased that he is here tonight. And I want you to join me in giving Governor Orval Faubus a warm welcome.
First, a suggestion to Bob Beeson, Child Museum, and others who sponsor this event. Why don't you put it in April or May? April when the redwoods in bloom, and May when the dogwoods in bloom, and we won't have this cold. See, I'm an Ozarker, I know the seasons. Ms. Young told my story. But I wonder, how many of you have heard my story about the Quaker and how they unruly cow? You know, Quakers are members of a cattle sect. They don't believe in war, either private or national. Now, they'll go to war and do their duty in the non-combat services, as I've seen them do, but they just don't believe in bearing arms. I understand that they don't use strong language, and I guess that's one reason we never had any in the Ozarks, because you couldn't plow a mule in new ground without using strong language. I understand they don't even quarrel with their wives. That's quite a bit different from these Presbyterians and Methodists that I know. But anyhow, he lived out in the rural area and he had this cow that was hard to manage. She was very unruly. He went out to milk one cold morning. She was more unruly than usual. She switched her tail in his face. She kicked the milk bucket out of his hands and finally kicked him over in the dirt of the barnyard. Now I remember the teaching of his religion. He was seeking for some way to express himself when he got up and brushed the dirt from his clothing. And he got around in front of the old cow and he looked her straight in the eye and he said, "Old cow, thou knowest I am a Quaker. Thou knowest I cannot use strong language. Thou knowest I cannot abuse thee in retaliation for thy unruliness. But, old cow, let me tell thee something thou dost not know. I can sell thee to a Baptist and he can beat hell out of thee." I can tell I don't Baptist because I'm one of that tribe, you see. I'm the author of some books. This little blue book is about the accomplishments of the administration. And incidentally, one of the accomplishments when I was governor is this hard surface road through here all the way. And then there's this book, The Little Australian, which takes its title from that little Australian terrier on the cover. Belonged to my son, and when he got so bad he couldn't take care of it, he turned it over to me, and I fell in love with it, and me, got killed. So that's how the book got its title, The Little Australian, because it's a little Australian terrier. So when I started writing about it, I just decided I would write about most all the dogs that I had, from the time I was a youngster on up to the present time. See, when I was growing up, a dog had to be useful. If he weren't useful, you got rid of him. Now we keep them as pets. And I spend more on dog food than my dad raising us 7 kids. That's how life has changed. So this book shows the changes in life in the Ozarks and the way we live about as clearly as anything could by its series of stories, one to another. There's no other book like it. It cost only $10. I'll sell you one back here. And then there's a big book back there about accomplishments of my administration. You buy either one of those, and I'll give you one of these to go with it. Jan and I have had some many difficulties lately, many things that I didn't get to make copies of this speech and type it. I just never had time to type it, so I may be a little bit slower as I go through it because it's all handwritten here. And I always did have difficulty reading my handwriting. Of course, I grew up in this region. I was never out of the shadow of these mountains until I was grown. Until I grew much older and learned more about the world, I didn't realize that along with the residents of this region of my age, I grew up in an area that had reached its maximum growth at an earlier time. The economy paused briefly, and then began the decline that has continued to this day. Now that I think back over my life and my experiences, I can't recall seeing one new building erected in Combs, the settlement near which I grew up and visited often during the days of my youth. Nor was there any growth to be noted in the settlements I noted along the branch line of the Fiscal Railroad that ran from Fayetteville to Pettigrew. The railroad was already built. The hands were paid and gone. Every schoolhouse was already erected along the railroad or back in the hills. The only new schoolhouse built in this whole area during my lifetime was the highway school beside Highway number 23 north of the Whitmore Gap. And the building is still there now, converted to a residence. And it was already finished and in use when I passed it on foot on my way to Huntsville to take the teaching examination in March 1928. So you see how little the area was stagnant, stultified. The growth had already been, and the workers had departed. Now that was 65 years ago when I passed the highway school on foot on the way to Huntsville. In Combs, when I was a small boy, there was the railroad station with the telegraph office with the keys clicking out the unknown messages except to the trained operator. There was the section house, an imposing brick building, the residence of the section foreman, who with his crew of section hands, railroad workers, maintained several miles of the railroad track east to St. Paul and perhaps to Pettigrew, I don't know, and west to Delanian Crosses. Then there was another section house and division point at Elkins. I think that was the only two on the railroad from Fayetteville to Pettigrew. Also at Combs there was the water tower, an elevated wooden tank filled with water pumped from White River. On its outward morning run eastward, the train always stopped there. A crewman of the train, or the water tank watchman, climbed up and lowered the huge spout and poured the water into the locomotive. That's where it got its water, on its way out and back. That was where some of the big boys, I was so small then, walked down to the halted train, swung on to the coaches and boxcars, and rode it into the station. I always wanted to do that, but I was too small or too shy. Never did. So much for lost opportunities. Now, besides the railroad property in Combs now, there were in Combs 3 hotels, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 barber shops, and perhaps a half-dozen general stores, one of which contained the Combs post office. Nearby was a grist mill for grinding corn into meal, always on Saturday. I talked about that a year ago when I was here. And during the week, it was a jackleg sawmill for the people who brought in lumber, logs to be sawed. Now, Combs was still more fortunate in those early days. A second railroad was built, which ran some 18 miles southeast to Cass. It had its own separate depot in Combs. That made Combs the only town in the region that had 2 separate railroad stations for 2 separate railroad lines. 3 hotels. My grandmother worked at one of them. Now, Connie, we want to find out from you, was that spelled M-E-A-D-O-R-S or M-E-A-D-O-W-S?
Well, I'm not real sure, but I think it was a W.
Well, I think it was the other way. I don't know. I thought I might just confirm it with you. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, however, the boomtown on the Frisco line was St. Paul. It had a city government with a mayor and a law enforcement officer. It was the only town in the wide region that had a city jail. At least the only one in Madison County, except the county seat of Huntsville. And I think I had an Uncle Hobbs that was in both of them. The streets were marked off and named. There was a solid row of business houses from the present location of Highway 23, where it goes through St. Paul, south, including in later years, Castile's barbershop. And in the early days, at the first street corner, J.P. Salyer's General Store. And there's an old picture that shows that sign. And Dad always called him Uncle John, because that was Dad's uncle. He was the son of Fielding, F-I-E-L-D-A-S, the way it was spelled, who came from Kentucky, and settled St. Paul and owned all of that level land in the bottoms. So the railroad decided to come in. They got an engineer to survey it and to survey the town, the streets and everything, the names. And John P. Salyers furnished the land, because he'd inherited it from his father. And then it was split 3 ways. The engineer got a third, the railroad got a third, and John P. Salyers got a third, and they started selling lots to build St. Paul. Well, all of them grew wealthy, of course. Then there was the famous Wash-Kendrick General Store. Anybody here remember the Wash-Kendrick General Store? Which grew up with the town, prospered with the town, and died with it as the settlement expired. I always admired the tenacity of the old gentleman. He stayed with that store as it went down, 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 and never did leave it. And since they couldn't get him to leave St. Paul, his son came back and stayed with him, helped take care of him, and run the store until he died. And he has a daughter who lives over in Newport, Arkansas, and married to a doctor over there. Then next was the well-known Gilstrap dry goods store. Oh, they were known throughout the country because they were well off. The Gilstraps were succeeded later by Wood Barber, a prominent citizen of the region. Now they're all gone. Around the corner was the Bank of St. Paul, founded and owned by the Crawfords, which we talked about 2 years ago. In my youth, 1928 to the 1930s, it was run by a young man by the name of Mac Grau, G-R-A-U-E, who brought out from Fayetteville. Grau has an indelible place in my heart and in my history that will never white son-in-law. And one of the biggest jokes and fun we had out of my father was he went to St. Paul once, and he visited the editor, and then came home. And the next week the paper came out, said a visitor in St. Paul was J.S. Faubus, a prosperous farmer of Greasy Creek. Prosperous. Well, we never had enough clothes and sometimes had to live on black-eyed peas and sorghum molasses. We really carried him high for as long as we can remember about how important that he was a prosperous farmer of Greasy Creek. Now, across the street was another general store, and I can't think of the man's name already. But right beside it was a drugstore, a pharmacy, run at the last before it was destroyed in a disastrous fire by my friend and one whom I greatly admired, Kelly Cornett. Cornetts were prominent at Dutton and at St. Paul. The Cornett family was prominent and well known in the region, and as smart as I have ever known academically. Kelly was state controller in my administration when he died in January 1959. Farther down the street was the surviving blacksmith shop, run in my time by perhaps the most famous blacksmith in the whole region. His name was Jess Moody, and he probably made more coffins for the deceased of the region than any other man, and always without charge. He was quite a conversationalist, and one of his boasts was, "I can mend anything except a broken heart." Back of this line of businesses was the Glendale Hotel, which was known throughout the region. And not far away, as isolated as possible, was the city jail that I've already mentioned. Now, Pettigrew also had a bank, and for a brief time a newspaper. The paper soon failed because it had come to this region that was stagnant as to growth and was beginning to die. So the newspaper failed and moved away. So all along the railroad line, the towns that had sprung up in hope and promise of growth saw the decline of the economy of the region, the disappearance of the railroad, and eventually the obliteration of the settlements, or the reduction to ghost town status. Pettigrew, Dutton, St. Paul, Bashir Switch, Holmes, Patrick, Delaney, Crosses, and one named Thompson. All in Madison County, and Durham, Elkins, and Harris in Washington County. And we meet in one of those ghost towns tonight. Now, what was the attraction, the force, that brought settlers with the thousands from many points into these rugged but beautiful Ozark hills? Timber. Timber. Hardwood timber. Trees with the tens of thousands, mostly oak. The white oak was the most desirable and the best known, and the area in the Forest Service was called the Land of the White Oak. First movie I ever saw was The Forest, trying to teach us not to burn the woods. I never thought they'd accomplish it with some of those old mountaineers, but they did. White oak was desirable for a number of reasons, but there were a number of varieties of other oak, black oak, spotted oak, pin oak, and so forth. Then there was ash and hickory, of a number of varieties. There were some softwoods, as black gum and sweet gum, and a rare specimen, linwood, which we call lin for short, sought after for lumber to be used by the mountaineers to make wagon beds, because the wood was pliable and light, and the less weight in the wagon bed, the better. But nowhere in all the White River Valley and its tributaries, and for some distance on each side, much pine is what I got out of the hills. My earliest recollection of Holmes, St. Paul, Delaney, and the other towns I saw along the line are of what seemed to me vast areas of stacked hardwood lumber products, cross ties by the hundreds and hundreds, not sawed out in a sawmill then, but fashioned with the double bit chopping axe and the old-fashioned broadaxe. I used to score with the double bit axe, and then Dad would hew with the broadaxe. 6 by 8 was 30 cents, and 7 by 9 was 40 cents most of the time. And then fence posts by the thousands left the fence canvases. Hickory splits, stave bowls, bourbon, and perhaps other products. Bourbon with short bowls of white oak, not more than 30 inches long or less, split into bolts, as we call it, to go to the mills, probably in Kentucky, in which bourbon whiskey was contained. Now you know why the Prohibition era made it more difficult for us mountaineers. It destroyed our market for stave bolts to make whiskey barrels and bourbon for kegs. The market opened up strong when Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and Prohibition was repealed. It made some new rich, or at least well-to-do men in the stave business, white oaks, and see that white oak had a chance to grow all the time we had Prohibition. There's one good thing about it. And some of those men were Arlie Sparks, who hailed from this region, and Robert Farmer, who was county judge of the county, and for a time Dalton Dobson. There was one with a stave mill at Kingston, who was my good friend. His name as well as do my middle name, but I can't think of it right now.
Field.
Right. Field is right. But at the time, mother helped him saw for a while after we first got married. And then she got too busy raising kids and doing other work so necessary on the farm, washing, ironing, patching or mending clothes, canning vegetables and fruit, or drying beans, apples, or peaches, caring for the chicken flock and milking the cows, and a few other things that you can have. At that time, Dad often worked alone. His difficulty was cutting the tree down, with a crosscut saw. And the one end that stuck out on the other side with no hold of it would flop up and down. And I remember him cutting the stake and driving the stake down to where it was the proper height. And as he'd saw through there, the saw would flop down and hit the top of that stake, and it didn't flop so much, made it easier for him to cut the tree down, sawing alone. But as soon as I got big of that, I replaced the stake. I know that I was helping him, not later than 7 years of age. So pick out some kid 7 years old and see how you think his little pounding one end for crosscut saw. I was helping maybe at a slightly earlier age than that. And I might not be able to pull much on the saw, but I could keep it from flopping up and down on the side opposite where my dad was using it. I sometimes continued to the point of exhaustion. I can all clearly recall one time on the brink of the highest mountain, my back had just given out, and when the tree began to fall and the saw stopped moving, I just keeled over on the dry leaves and the stones and let the tree hit the earth. Now usually we got out and run back a ways, to keep from getting hurt, or we had to watch for the limbs. As the tree fell, it might pull down limbs on others, and then they'd release them and they'd throw them back. And there were injuries that way lots of times. I had a sinus condition when I was a youngster and I always felt bad. Go out with the boys on Sunday and we'd play up and down the creek and they'd come home feeling fine and I'd come home dragging. It bothered me then. One day I felt awful. Actually, if I felt that bad now, I guess I'd go to the hospital. We usually do. But the corn might need to be plowed. It might be time to plant the potatoes or do something else. But if we ran out of food, we had to go to the woods. Take in a little load of lumber of some kind to the market and get a few dollars for it and buy the necessities that we had to have to come back home. That was the case this time when we went out that day. And I felt awful. I felt so bad. I just wanted something to happen so we could go back to the house and I could lie down. Well, Dad was loading a log that day to take into the mill at Coles. And somehow or other, when the mules were pulling the chains that rolled it up the skids onto the bunks, it turned crosswise and it fell right across that covering pole and snapped it just like it was a toothpick. I thought, now we get to quit and go to the house. But no. Dad's a pretty good carpenter. The covering pole was long. So he just discarded part of it and screwed the other one up, bored a new hole, the wagon was ready to go again. And we finally loaded that confounded log and he took it off to the market. In the post, Dad would split and we would peel. Now, if it was in the spring of the year when the sap was up, you get that peel off, bark off pretty easy. But it was winter time when it was clean and tight, you know, like heavy bark does in the winter. It took 1,000 strokes of an axe to get that post peeled, and it had to be peeled before they take them in the market. Every once in a while, somebody get orders for a post of various kinds. So they came to an order, they were buying at Coles. They were buying locust, mulberry, and redwood. Now, usually they weren't bought. So here we went hunting every mulberry tree on the farm. Even cut down the mulberry tree by the upper field county up there, where we'd gotten mulberries when we'd be working. And I had to help cut it down. I sure did hate that. And then it was spring and the redbud was in bloom, so you could see that beautiful tree in the forest, and that guy did the way to it, and down and cut it, and cut one or two posts to take to the market. I didn't like that. Cut the mulberry tree, or cutting down the beautiful dogwood. Also, around our house, well, we had a bunch of goats. Now, they can thrive in the woods, you don't have to feed them much. But Dad started cutting down the maple trees and the dogwood trees that had buds early in the spring, and those goats would just pile in there and eat, you know, the new growth. We had one of the ugliest places in the mountains because he cut down all the beautiful trees around it and just left, you know, the post oak and the old black oak, because the white oak was about all gone. But that's just a sideline of this. Then one year, Dad was going away to work. Up on the mountainside next to the top of Faubus Mountain, as we call it, there was a fine growth of Chinquapin. Often there we had hunted Chinquapins in the autumn. You know, you throw rocks or clubs up in the trees when the burrs are open, or jar them with a rock, and the Chinquapins fall out, and then you pick them up. You could sell them for $1 a gallon to the folks in town occasionally, but most of the time we kept them. But one thing you had to learn, you had to bake them or boil them to kill the eggs that had been laid in there with the bugs, or you wouldn't have any Chinquapins if you saved them very long. But anyhow, Dad didn't want to cut the Chinquapin trees. He has gone away. I decided, and they were buying Chinquapin post at the time, so I decided while the market was ready, we'd cut some of those tall, slender Chinquapins. I got my brother to help me. I couldn't have been more than 14 or 15 at the time, and my brother Elvin was 3.5 years younger. He was about 10 or 11, depending on how old I was. So up on the mountainside we go with all the tools, crosscut saw and axes, and we cut down those Chinquapin trees, and we make enough posts peeled and ready for a wagon load. In fact, we made 2 wagon loads. And then we'd harness the team, everything up the mountainside, load them on, take them to the market. Off of a mountain, so steep that it's hard for a goat to negotiate. But we were used to, that's the kind of life we knew all the time when we were growing up there. We got enough money for each load, for each of us to buy 1 pair of slippers, we call them Oxfords. Need a pair of lift shoes. About 14 or 15 years old, we're getting big enough, you know, to be noticed by the girls, so they had to have a pair of Oxfords. I remember the finest stretch of timber we had. I looked at it before we got there. All easy working black oak or spotted oak. Standing almost like wheat straws with the leaves stripped off. When we got into that, we were falling trees right and left, plenty of them, and making into cross ties. And our neighbor Wilkie's worked up to the line on his side of the property. And in that growth of timber was a hawk's nest high in a tree. If you ever go out in the mountains to find a hawk's nest, you want to find the most difficult terrain there is. And a tree that is the most difficult, where if you'd fall out of it, you'd go hundreds and hundreds of feet below, not just at the foot of the tree. But that's the way the hawks selected their trees where they built their nests. And in that was the hawk's nest, and we cut the tree with the hawk's nest. And I was anxious to see. And there were 2 young hawks in it, and of course they were killed when the tree hit the ground. Dad kept saying all the time, when we were doing this arduous labor, someday this timber's going to be gone, then what are we going to do? I heard him say it, I guess, 1,000 times. But he didn't know how to cope. He got interested, you know, in purebred livestock, not the scrubs that we had, because the cows we had and the calves could run like a deer. We had to hunt them and drive them in. And then he decided to get some purebred laying hens, and he got a flock of brown leghorns. And boy, they were good layers. There were lots of eggs, white and nice. But you couldn't make any money then selling eggs. In the wintertime, when they weren't laying, it'd be 50 cents a dozen. And then when the hens all started laying in the spring, it'd come down to 10 cents. You can remember it, some of you were here at the time. There were some jobs at the sawmills, and I was not strong enough to handle them. The competition for the jobs was very strong anyway. Then there was the timber inspector. Sometimes he was liked. There was always some concern about him, and sometimes we feared him. I remember this one named Finn Bashir, who worked for the Barron Lumber Company at Combs for many, many years, where he took the timber. He seemed to be a pretty understanding fellow. I kind of liked him because years later, when I was running for governor, he came out for me. He said he knew me when I used to haul posts and timber in there, and I was a good boy and make a good governor. Of course, Finn Bashir was long gone. Then living beside us was Adam Myford. He was a tie inspector, a cross-tie inspector. And he walked to Combs each day and took up the ties and then walked home. I worked for him on his farm there at 50 cents a day from sun to sun. But we wanted to get our ties taken and not cut. Now, once in a while they cut, and then they give you a nickel for it and put it in the stack. Dad wouldn't take it. We'd haul the tie back home, use it for a corner post in the fence. I don't know if you all use that or not, but I guess the rest of us kids could. Well, if the tie had a hollow So we knew that he'd covered it with the hole in it. So Dad would get a piece of timber, another tree, the same color as that one, shape it as near as he could to fit the hole, and we'd drive it in so tight that it'd be airtight. It'd hold water, air, anything. Then we'd take the saw and saw it off, so everything was just smooth and there. Then when we went to get it out to load, we'd skid it through the mud. We had mud on that end of it. And I'll tell you, you never did catch us. We got it by the time. But now, we didn't think we cheated because we knew that would last just as long as any of the others. Rough mountaineers had muscles as hard as iron, tough as leather. A fist fight between two such characters was something to behold in those days. It's sometimes worse. Tom Johnson, who lived over Mill Creek, he's a brother to my uncle, married my mother's sister, went to St. Paul reunion, got into a fight with somebody, and they just cut him open. His innards just fell out. Gravel got dirty. Well, they took him up, washed him, and put him back inside and sewed him up. He went home on the train from St. Paul to Coles, and then 3 miles out in the country to where he lived. And the next day he got up and come back to Coles, went back to St. Paul to have his wounds dressed. Now, when he'd had, just been cut open. That's how tough they were. John Mulraven, they said, was hired by the railroad as conductor on the St. Paul branch because he was a big, old, red-faced Irishman, was tough enough to keep order and control those mountaineers when they wanted to cause any kind of a disturbance. He and Dad got to be friends. He'd bring Dad magazines to read. Dad sometimes walked through the hills to St. Paul, and then he'd catch the train from St. Paul back to Coles. Never bought a ticket. Just cost 17 cents, but 17 cents is like $17 now. And old John Munray would come along and see him, and he'd always notice Dad help him unload the freight when the train stopped at the station. See, the train never could have made its run on time if they hadn't had volunteers there to unload the freight when it was stopped. He'd come along and see Dad, pat him on the shoulder, and go on. Didn't charge him. Dad was more proud than if he'd have been elected president. The recognition. Then there were a lot of stories about, I'm about finished here. A lot of stories about the old rough mountaineers. And of course, the sawmills, the sawyer was the main man, the skill to run that saw, to keep it going, and get the lumber of the right dimensions, thickness. But anyhow, and there were accidents at times, and that saw was dangerous. They didn't have all the safety devices they have here. But anyhow, the story about this old fellow who was quite a heavy drinker and a character known throughout the country. He was a sawyer. And he was there one day in an accident, and he fell on the saw. Now this is a Press Eversole story. An old puppy leader down the corner. He fell on the saw, and it cut him clean into the middle. The lower half fell on one side, and the upper half fell on the other side. So along come one of his friends, and could still speak to the half, that could talk. And the old man had a request of him. He said, well, what do you want? He said, hand me that pint of liquor out of my hip pocket on the other side. I remember one day viewing the main Grizzly Creek Road from a place that was once our last home up there. In the valley, I counted 32 wagons loaded with timber that had gathered just by chance from side roads of the area, each driven by the owner of the team, the wagon, and the timber, all on their way to the timber buyer at Coles. Now that's how thickly the hills were settled and how much activity was going on. came in here, the same wagons, the same conveyors from every direction. Some of them took 2 days. They had places, regular places to camp. Because this was the end of the line, and you had to have a railroad to transport all the timber products out. Pettigrew became the largest hardwood lumber market in the world. See, this was the only area where you had hardwoods like that, almost exclusively. The finest timber gone, the decline of the economy began, and before the Great Depression was ushered in that Black Thursday in 1929, the hard times were already on the people in these hills. The railroad was taken up in 1936, and soon the decline was complete. Now the ghost settlements remain. We meet in one tonight. Now, if one knowledgeable as I of what once was travels back into the hilly region of the once proud homesteads and the homesteaders, he looks for the haul roads and the once tillable fields in vain. They're gone. Even those roads that were once well worn, main avenues of travel, are at least partially overgrown and difficult to discern. Roy, you travel some of those with me in the region where I was raised. If it is a blustery March day, I seem to hear in the gusting wind the singing of the saws and the crash of falling trees. There comes also the sound of clucking wagons and the muted voices of the mountaineer owners as they urge their tough, sure-footed teams along the winding and often precipitous mountain roads. On a better day, when sound carries well, I hear the ghostly whistle of a ghostly locomotive as it snakes an equally ghostly train along the Valley Railroad. The ghost of the real trains, which brought the once teeming activity to the region and then left it as it languished and died. For the way of life we once knew in this region of hardwood timber is gone from our proud hills forever.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor Faubus, for that.